Pam Bondi rose from her seat with a calm but commanding presence. The air in the room shifted instantly, tension thickening as all eyes turned toward her. There was no need for grand theatrics. Her confidence alone was enough to silence the high murmurs. She didn't need permission to speak, nor did she wait for an invitation. She simply took control, as she always did when the moment demanded it. With deliberate steps, she approached the center of the room, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. There was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke. Every word was measured, every syllable sharpened by years of experience in the courtroom and the political arena. She had built a career on exposing lies, dissecting weak arguments, and holding people accountable, and today would be no different. She began with a statement so simple yet so cutting that the silence became deafening. She wasn't here for surface-level debates or empty rhetoric. She was here for the truth, and she was going to lay it out for everyone to see. The facts were not on the side of those who relied on emotional manipulation or misleading narratives, and she had no patience for those who twisted reality to fit their agenda. Her voice carried through the room with an unwavering steadiness. There was no anger, no unnecessary dramatics, only a relentless pursuit of clarity. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. The weight of her words was enough to draw people in, to force them to listen. And as she spoke, she could see the shifting expressions, the growing discomfort in those who had built their arguments on shaky ground. She had come prepared, as she always did. The numbers, the historical records, the undeniable contradictions, she laid them out one by one, a steady and deliberate dismantling of false narratives. Every claim that had been thrown around so carelessly was now under a microscope, and the reality was impossible to ignore. She addressed the fundamental issues at hand, refusing to be sidetracked by deflections or distractions. There was a pattern. One that had repeated itself time and time again. Lofty promises, bold statements, but when it came to actual results, the facts told a different story. The policies that had been touted as solutions had done nothing but create deeper problems. And yet, instead of accountability, there was only blame shifting and misdirection. She didn't mince words when she spoke about the real impact on everyday Americans, the people who couldn't afford to buy into illusions. The ones who lived, with the consequences of bad decisions made by those who never had to face them. It was easy to talk about change from a comfortable distance, to speak in broad, idealistic terms without ever acknowledging the reality on the ground. But she wasn't interested in abstractions, she was interested in results. Her words weren't just arguments, they were a wake-up call. A challenge to those who had convinced themselves that image mattered more than action, that words alone could erase failures. She had spent too many years fighting for justice to let misleading narratives go unchallenged. She moved with precision, each point building upon the last, tightening the grip of undeniable truth. There was no need for personal attacks or cheap shots. She had something far more powerful, reality. And reality was not on the side of those who clung to illusions. As she spoke, she could see the shifting postures, the subtle glances exchanged, between those who had spent too long ignoring inconvenient facts. There was no escape from this moment, no easy way out. Every attempt to sidestep accountability had just been exposed for what it was. And yet, despite the intensity of her words, she never lost her composure. She never faltered. Because she knew something they didn't. Truth has a way of cutting through the noise, of standing tall even when surrounded by deception. And today, the truth had found its voice. Pam Bondi stood firm, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who had spent years dissecting arguments and exposing inconsistencies. She had no intention of letting this moment pass without shining a light on the blatant contradictions that had been paraded as principles. She had seen it all before. The smooth rhetoric, the carefully rehearsed lines, the selective outrage that conveniently ignored reality. But today, she wasn't going to let those tactics go unchallenged. She started with a simple but undeniable truth. There were two sets of rules being played here. One for those who preached from a pedestal, and another for the everyday Americans who bore the consequences of those empty promises. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet it had been dressed up as virtue for so long that some had come to accept it without question. She wasn't about to let that continue. She pointed out the contradictions in stark detail. It was always the same pattern. Bold claims about standing up for the people, only for the very policies being pushed to hurt the ones they were supposed to help. The promises of fairness and equity crumbled under the weight of reality, leaving communities struggling while those in power found ways to shield themselves from the damage. Her voice didn't waver as she laid out example after example, each one cutting deeper into the illusion that had been carefully constructed. The policies that had been pushed with such self-righteous certainty had done nothing but create division, weaken institutions, and leave hard-working people paying the price. And yet those responsible never seemed to suffer the consequences of their own decisions. She spoke of the misplaced priorities, the way outrage was selectively applied depending on who was involved. When it suited the narrative, the slightest infraction became a national crisis. But when the facts pointed in a different direction, suddenly there was silence. The double standard was undeniable, and the American people saw it for what it was. She didn't hold back when she addressed the sheer arrogance of those who demanded sacrifices from others while refusing to live by the same rules themselves. The lectures about morality and responsibility rang hollow when coming from those who had no intention of making the same sacrifices they expected from everyone else. It was easy to preach about economic burdens when sitting in a position of privilege, untouched by the hardships faced by millions. It was easy to advocate for policies that weakened law enforcement when surrounded by personal security. The audacity of it all was breathtaking. Those who claimed to fight for the people had built entire careers on selling illusions, pushing policies that sounded good in speeches, but failed in practice. And when those policies failed, when crime soared, when businesses collapsed, when communities suffered, it was never their fault. There was always someone else to blame, always a new excuse, always another empty promise that things would be different next time. She had seen it before, and she knew exactly how this game was played. The strategy was predictable. Attack those who challenged the status quo, label them as extremists, dismiss them as out of touch. But what they failed to understand was that the American people weren't blind to what was happening. They weren't fooled by the carefully curated outrage or the manufactured narratives. They saw the hypocrisy, and they were tired of it. She reminded them that leadership wasn't about saying the right things in front of a camera. It was about standing by, principles even when it was inconvenient. It was about being willing to live under the same rules that were imposed on everyone else. And most of all, it was about delivering results, not excuses. She didn't need to shout to make her point. The facts spoke for themselves. The pattern was too clear to ignore, the contradictions too glaring to dismiss. And as she finished making her case, there was no doubt left in the room about the reality of the double standard that had been exposed. Pam Bondi stood with the same unshakable confidence she had carried throughout her career. The weight of the moment was pressing down, but she thrived under pressure. Her gaze was steady, her demeanor calm yet commanding. There was no need for theatrics. She had something far more powerful, the truth. And once again, she was about to prove that the truth was sharper than any scripted talking point. The tension in the room was undeniable. The argument had unfolded predictably, the usual grandstanding met with rehearsed rebuttals. But there was a difference this time. She wasn't here to play the game, to engage in pointless back and forths that led nowhere. She had waited, listening carefully, allowing every weak argument to be laid out in full before striking. And now, it was time. Her voice was even, but there was no mistaking the fire behind her words. There was something almost surgical about the way she dismantled the narrative that had just been presented. She wasn't merely responding. She was exposing, peeling back the layers of deception with each precise and deliberate statement. She began by repeating, almost word for word, the claims that had just been made. Not in mockery, but with an edge of finality, as if to ask, "Do you hear yourself?" It was the perfect setup for what came next. She paused just long enough to let the weight of those words sink in before she struck them down, one by one, using nothing but cold, hard reality. She didn't rely on speculation or spin. She had the facts, and they were damning. Every assertion, every carefully crafted talking point that had been used to defend the indefensible fell apart under the sheer weight of undeniable truth. The numbers, the policies, the real-world consequences. She laid them all out, leaving no room for interpretation. Then came the moment. The one people would talk about long after the cameras stopped rolling. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't pre-planned. It was pure instinct, the kind that only comes from years of battling deception and holding the powerful accountable. With an almost unsettling calm, she delivered a single, cutting line, just a few words, but they landed like a thunderclap. The kind of statement that made the entire room collectively hold its breath. The kind that sliced through the noise and left nothing but silence in its wake. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, the unmistakable look of someone who had just realized they had no response. No clever comeback, no scripted retort. The very foundation of their argument had just been obliterated, and everyone in the room knew it. Pam didn't smirk, didn't revel in the discomfort. She didn't need to. Her point had been made. The truth had done what it always did when wielded correctly. It had cut through the nonsense, through the deflections and distractions, and laid reality bare for all to see. The silence stretched, heavy and unrelenting. There was nothing left to say. The carefully maintained illusion had been shattered in an instant, and no amount of spin could put it back together. Those watching, whether in the room or on their screens, had just witnessed something undeniable. A moment of clarity in a world too often clouded by deception. Pam stood firm, unshaken, unaffected by the stunned expressions around her. She had done what she had come to do. And as the weight of her words settled over the room, the message was clear. The truth would always win. The room was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, thick with the realization that something had just happened, something that couldn't be ignored, rewritten, or spun into a different narrative. Pam Bondi had spoken, and the impact of her words still lingered, echoing in the stunned expressions of those around her. She stood firm, completely unfazed by the tension that now filled the air. There was no need for further elaboration. She had laid out the truth with unshakable precision, and everyone in the room knew it. The energy had shifted, the momentum completely reversed. What had started as an attempt to discredit, to spin, to manipulate, had backfired spectacularly. People exchanged glances, unsure how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided eye contact altogether. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. It was the kind of pause that said more than any words could. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because to do so meant acknowledging what had just taken place. The weight of the moment wasn't just in the words she had spoken. It was in what those words had exposed. A facade had been shattered, a carefully crafted illusion torn apart in front of everyone, and now, with nowhere to hide, the reality of the situation was settling in. Pam didn't smirk, didn't gloat. That wasn't her style. She didn't need to celebrate a victory that was already so obvious. The truth spoke for itself. And as she remained standing, her confidence unwavering, it was clear that this wasn't just another debate. It was a reckoning. The usual tactics, the deflections, the rehearsed responses, the attempts to twist the narrative had failed. Not because they weren't tried, but because they had been rendered useless in the face of cold, undeniable facts. She had seen the pattern before, had watched countless times as attempts were made to manipulate public perception. But today, none of it had worked. The cameras captured everything, every flicker of discomfort, every forced half-smile that couldn't quite mask the defeat. The audience, both in the room and watching from a distance, had witnessed something rare. Accountability, delivered in real time, without apology, without hesitation. There was a certain poetic justice in the way it had unfolded. The moment hadn't been forced. It had simply happened, a natural consequence of speaking the truth in a space where deception had thrived for too long. And now, with the truth laid bare, there was nothing left to hide behind. Pam remained composed, her presence alone commanding the room. There was nothing more she needed to say. The silence was proof enough that her point had been made. The response, if there even was one, wouldn't matter. The damage was done, and no amount of backtracking or reframing could undo it. This wasn't just about a single conversation or a fleeting political moment. It was about something deeper, the power of standing firm in the face of dishonesty, of refusing to be intimidated or silenced. And as the seconds dragged on, with no one daring to fill the silence, it was clear that this moment would not be easily forgotten. Pam Bondi took one last look around the room, her expression unwavering. The silence that followed her words was more powerful than any rebuttal could have been. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. No spin, no clever misdirection could erase what had just happened. The weight of her argument lingered in the air. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, waiting for someone, anyone, to step in and salvage the moment. But there was nothing left to be said. She had exposed the contradictions, dismantled the empty rhetoric, and left no room for excuses. She didn't need to elaborate further. The facts stood on their own, shining a light on the hypocrisy that had gone unchecked for too long. She had not come here to argue for the sake of arguing. She had come to tell the truth, and she had done exactly that. As she straightened her posture, there was a quiet confidence about her, a certainty that she had done what needed to be done. She wasn't looking for applause, wasn't interested in theatrics. The impact of her words would speak for itself long after she walked away. She had spent her career fighting for justice, for truth, for accountability. And today was no different. The people watching, whether in the room or through their screens, had just witnessed what it looked like to stand firm in the face of deception, to refuse to back down when it mattered most. She took a breath, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, letting the moment settle in. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a room full of people forced to confront a reality they could no